Somebody mentioned to me last week, we're of course in our study of the intertestamental period. Somebody told me last week, I've really enlisted and asked for feedback, not necessarily always here publicly from the lectern, but from several people as we've gone through this, because I realize it is a lot of history. Not everybody is big into history. That could be a little more dry for some folks. To me, it's fascinating, but I know not everybody's like me. But I've asked people several times, like, help give me some feedback. I've got some folks that are close enough to me, and I think I've told y'all before maybe that when I was first starting out preaching, I was still 18 years old, and sometimes I'd go to various little tiny congregations and preach, and people were being nice. But, you get to the back of the auditorium. I preached a lot at White Plains, over in White Plains, Alabama. Maybe 20 people at most on a Sunday evening, and I'd preach, and they all come out, and you know what they say? That was great. Great job. You could have stumbled through and just stuttered and, couldn't get your thoughts together, and they'd come out and they'd say, great job. And I was thankful for that because, especially as a young preacher, you need that encouragement. But at the same time, there were certain people. There was a brother from my home congregation, and sometimes he would come out and he would be out there on a Sunday night. And so I could ask him, Paul was his name, and I'd say, Paul, I said, I know you'll tell me the truth. How'd that go? And he'd sometimes say, I've heard you do better. Or sometimes he'd say, I don't really know what you were talking about. And so that was good feedback. You need that encouragement, but you also need some tough love sometimes. And so I've asked some folks here in the class even to say, I'm depending on you to give me that tough love sometimes and say, hey, Chad, you gotta pull it together. You're getting a little dry, because I know this is a deeper study and it can be more technical. Some of that I can't help because it's just a deeper study, and that's one of the reasons I did this while Chris has a good class on fundamentals going. But one of the things that was suggested last week, I believe, said I really like it when you have something in PowerPoint form or something visual, and I know I'm a visual person, so maybe this will be helpful. I've got 3 slides here: Assyrian rulers, Babylonian rulers, Persian or Medo-Persian rulers. Now, a lot of these, you may not even recognize the name because some of them don't even come into play with Bible history necessarily, or at least not by name. But some of the names you'll recognize. Over here, there's not really anything to connect these with a specific Bible passage, but you'll see over here like Tiglath-Pileser III, who's mentioned in 2 Kings 15 and 2 Kings 16. You got Shalmaneser. He conquered the northern kingdom. You read about that in 2 Kings chapter 17 and also in 2 Kings 18. There's not a whole lot of talk about him in particular because the emphasis is on Israel, their sins, and what led them to be taken captive, but it does mention that Shalmaneser is the one who conquered them. Sargon II, mentioned in Isaiah 20, verse 1. Then you have Sennacherib. You probably are familiar with Sennacherib from the biblical account, mentioned in 2 Kings 18 and 19, where of course, Assyria had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and so, as a world conqueror does, they set their sights then on the southern kingdom. And some time passes, so you have Shalmaneser conquering the north, kind of shore things up, and sometimes there's intrigue within the court, and somebody gets assassinated or something like that. But you end up with Sennacherib in charge, and he decides, I'm going after Judah, the southern kingdom, Judah. So he's going to go and try to conquer them, and by all rights, it looked like he was going to. You've heard, no doubt, of the archaeologist's discovery of Sennacherib's annals that said he had Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage, and yet he never conquered Judah. Of course, we know the rest of the story, 2 Kings 18 and 19. Hezekiah, unlike many of his forebears, instead of appealing to Egypt for help or someone else, he appeals to Jehovah to help them, understanding only Jehovah could help them, and God did. He helped them. And an angel of the Lord went out in one night and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Parallel is in 2 Chronicles 32, and also a parallel in Isaiah 36 and 37. Those are all detailed in that one account, but they're parallel passages. Sennacherib, of course, goes home, and while he's at home, he's murdered by two of his sons while he's worshiping his idolatrous god. Esarhaddon takes over. He's actually mentioned in 2 Kings 19, as that's at the end of that account where Sennacherib laid siege to Judah. It just mentions that he was killed and Esarhaddon reigned in his place. Ezra 4:2 he's mentioned, and Isaiah 37:38. And then you have Ashurbanipal. Now let's move on to, because we're still in the middle of talking about Persian kings, but I did want to mention this to hopefully give you a visual. And I just realized I meant to, of course it doesn't work for me right now anyways, but at some point what I may do in the weeks to come, since we've already covered the slides, once we've covered them, is to set them on an automatic loop where like every, 20, 30 seconds, it'll just rotate to the next slide, and that way you keep this before you all through the class. Maybe that'll be helpful. Or if you want a printout copy of it, I don't mind doing that as well. I'm combining dates. I've got several different studies. I went and read a book, portions of a book, a really good book by, give me a second. He wrote The Genesis Flood with another guy. Whitcomb. Thank you, Bob. I was about to say, Bob, maybe you could help me out. Whitcomb. Is it John? John C. Whitcomb? I think that's right. So, anyways, he wrote a book called Darius the Mede, I think is what it's called. And it's very helpful. So I kind of combined, I thought his dates were a little bit different, and I went with his because as a researcher and a historian, he's tough to beat, at least from what I've been able to determine. Now, let's talk about Babylonian rulers just very briefly, and like I said, I'm inserting this because hopefully it'll help you to have a little bit of a visual. Nabopolassar, no specific verse to tie him to. Nebuchadnezzar, again, you know that name. I'm not going to read off all the passages, but you can, I don't know, can y'all see that in the back? Is that even readable? So, but you know the passages extensively throughout Daniel. Mentioned in Nehemiah, Esther, a couple of verses, a verse in each of those, several times in Ezra, several times in 2 Kings, mentioned once in 1 Chronicles, several times in 2 Chronicles, and a lot in Jeremiah as well. Evil Merodach, he's mentioned in 2 Kings 25:27, because what's the king's name? Just drawing a blank, I'm struggling today. 2 Kings, what did I say, 25? He lifted up, it's not Zedekiah. Zedekiah had his eyes put out and he was killed. Jehoiakim, Chin, with the N, right? N is in no. There's Jehoiakim and there's Jehoiakim. They're easy to get confused. N, okay. Jehoiakim. So it was evil Merodach who, he takes Jehoiakim and he treats him kindly. And so he was good to him, nice to him, as opposed to just keeping him like, in a dungeon or whatever. He's also mentioned in Jeremiah 50 and 52, just a verse each there. Then you have Neriglissar, Laborosardoc. I worked on pronouncing that. That was on Friday. I should have practiced it again this morning. And honestly, sometimes you don't even know if you're pronouncing it right. You just practice it and try to sound like you know what you're talking about. But he only reigned for a few months in 556. Then Nabonidus, we talked about him when we were talking more about the Babylonian kingdom. And Belshazzar. Belshazzar, you have very similar dates, at least the exact same ending date as Nabonidus, because he was Nabonidus' son. He was made co-regent with his father. Nabonidus went off to conquer, seeking to conquer. So he put his son in charge. And so it was co-regent. And that's why when you get to... you have Belshazzar saying in Daniel 5, if somebody can interpret what this writing on the wall means, I'll make him, one of the promises was I'll make him third ruler in the kingdom. Well, you read that and you think, well, he's the king. Well, how would you be third ruler? Well, because he was second ruler in the kingdom. He was co-regent. So you see there he's mentioned in Daniel 5. Oh, okay. I couldn't read that necessarily. I couldn't read it very good on the back PowerPoint. Daniel chapter 5 several times. Daniel 7:1 and Daniel 8:1. Those are your Babylonian rulers. Now, all that just to basically get to the Persian, or Medo-Persian if you want to call them that, rulers. We talked extensively about Cyrus the Great. He is mentioned a number of times in Scripture, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Isaiah, Daniel prophesied years before he was even born. Cambyses, we talked about him. We finished up last week talking about Darius I, Hystaspes. He allowed the temple rebuild to resume, which had been halted. He's mentioned in numerous places in the book of Ezra, also in Haggai and Zechariah. Now, here's where I really wanted to make a note, because I did have a specific question about this. Don't confuse Darius the First, Hystaspes, with Darius the Mede of Daniel chapter 5, and numerous times throughout Daniel chapter 6, and also 9:1 and 11:1 of Daniel. This was Whitcomb's entire book. It's called, if I recall correctly, I think it's called Darius the Mede, or it may just be called Darius. But it's all about, for years people have accused the Bible of having an error, because Cyrus conquered Babylon. Well, how could you have Cyrus conquering Babylon, and the timeline didn't work there for that to be Darius Hystaspes, and so a lot of even some who were Bible believers, supposedly, they would say things like, well, it looks like Daniel just made a mistake here, and maybe he copied things down wrong or got his history wrong. Well, either the Bible is inspired and inerrant, or it's not. Well, for a long time, people just say, well, I just missed it here. Sometimes people come up with elaborate explanations that really just didn't work. Well, it turns out there's another Darius. He's Darius the Mede. He was put in charge of Babylon, it would appear, by Cyrus. So don't confuse those two. And that's, like I said, it's not a huge book that Whitcomb wrote, but it's pretty extensive, where he lays out the evidence showing this is a different Darius than the one who we call Hystaspes, or history calls Hystaspes. Then you have Xerxes. We'll talk about him today. We know him better as Ahasuerus, because that's how it's rendered in the Hebrew. 486 to 465 BC, he's infamous for his failed attempt to conquer Greece, which is kind of going to... A lot of historians date the decline of the Persian Empire from Artaxerxes, but I think you could at least make an argument it began with the failed conquest of Greece. He's mentioned there in Ezra 4:6. That's well, I'll just say that, and I'll get more information on that in just a moment. Mentioned in Ezra 4:6, which bridges this 58-year gap between the temple dedication and Ezra's arrival in Jerusalem. And, of course, he's going to be mentioned extensively throughout the book of Esther. Then you have Artaxerxes I, Longimanus. Why is he called Longimanus? It means the long-handed. He was reputed to have, I think it was his right hand that was reputed to be longer than the left. So he was called Artaxerxes the long-handed. Kind of reminds me of, if you ever study English history, you know where I'm going with this? Anybody know? Any of you history people? There was a king called Edward... Nobody? Edward Longshanks, right? He was tall. They called him King Edward Longshanks. I think it was Edward, right? Anyway, Artaxerxes the First is mentioned several times in Ezra, and he's also mentioned in Nehemiah. Darius Hystaspes, by the way, is mentioned in Zechariah and Haggai because it was during his reign, as pointed out here, the temple rebuild was allowed to resume. But you recall, before he actually gave permission, here come Haggai and Zechariah, and they say, get busy. You're building your own houses. You're just dwelling at ease and taking care of your own stuff, and you've neglected the house of the Lord. And so they say, get busy. So they start rebuilding. And then somebody comes along and wants to know, whoa, who gave the okay for this? And so they appeal to Darius to go look into the records, and you'll find this decree from Cyrus. Well, he did. And he found the decree, and he says, leave them alone. Let them finish their temple. And so that's the deal with that. So Artaxerxes, and then you have Darius II. Goes by Ocus or Ocus. Artaxerxes II, Memnon. Artaxerxes III, Ocus, however you pronounce that. Arces, and then Darius III. By the way, it seems Darius III is the Darius of Nehemiah 12:22. If you want to go look at that. Again, people have read this reference to Darius, and they kind of say, wait a minute, that timeline doesn't seem to add up. But it makes more sense when you understand it in that vein. Look at Nehemiah 12:22. The Levites in the days of Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, Jaddua were recorded, chief of the fathers, also the priest, to the reign of Darius the Persian. He's distinguished there as Darius the Persian. Of course, you know, over in the book of Daniel, this other one that we said don't get confused, he's called Darius the Mede. Darius the First is Darius Hystaspes. Sometimes he's called Darius the Great, but he's distinguished here as Darius the Persian. Sometimes you deal with similar names, and so I want to point that out. I hope that will be helpful to you as we go through all these Persians. And again, I'm dependent upon y'all for feedback and or questions. If something doesn't make sense, if something's, in fact, like I said, the question with Darius the First as opposed to Darius the Mede was a question that was asked. So I want to make sure we clarified that, because somebody said, well, wait a minute, is that somebody different? Is that the same person? So that said, if nothing else, questions or comments or anything with that? All right, let's talk about Xerxes. So we're right here. That's where we're talking today. Xerxes and the attempted conquest of Greece. As I said, we're getting near the end of the Persian Empire here, and you have two world empires after that, Greece and Rome, and then you have the opening of the New Testament during the fairly early days of the Roman Empire. So Xerxes, he had been carefully groomed as the successor to Darius. You may recall Darius had some questions as to his right to the throne, but it was not so with Xerxes, because he was a son of Darius, and he was the son of Darius by a daughter of Cyrus. He served 12 years as viceroy of Babylon, serving under his father, and then he succeeded Darius at the age of 35. I mentioned this just a moment ago, looking at this PowerPoint slide. The Persian form of the name Xerxes is, I have no idea how you pronounce this, so I'm just going to give it a shot, Kashayarsha, but it's rendered Ahasuerus in the Hebrew. So that's the reason why he's not just plainly called Xerxes in the Hebrew. There were revolts in the empire. Of course, Xerxes forward, you're going to read about revolts in the empire a lot. Every world leader has to deal with them, but Xerxes and forward, they had a lot more to deal with perhaps than others. Xerxes had to put down a revolt in Egypt, which he did. He put his brother Achaemenes in charge there. Babylon also rebelled. There were actually several who assumed the title King of Babylon and of the lands. That was the title that Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, and some of those folks bore, was King of Babylon and of the lands. Well, if over here the Persian Empire is in control, there's this ruler of the Persian Empire, and you claim, you title yourself King of Babylon and of the lands, well, that's a challenge. It would be bad enough if he called himself King of Babylon. So several people actually claimed that title, and Xerxes was determined he was going to humble Babylon, and he did. The walls were razed, not R-A-I-S-E-D, but R-A-Z-E-D, and the ornate temples in Babylon were destroyed. The famous temple Esagila was destroyed. The golden statue of Bel Marduk was melted down. Xerxes wanted to end the concept of a continuing Babylonian empire. Now, you recall Cyrus didn't do that. Cyrus would leave a Babylonian in charge many times, and locals in charge. And Cyrus and others continued this tradition of Babylonian rulers where they would go and enter the temple there at, what was it called? Esagila. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. They would enter the temple and take hold on New Year's Day of the hands of Marduk. It's the idea that their idol, their little g god, is ordaining you to lead Babylon. Xerxes is done with that. So he melts down that statue, and he went simply by the title now of King of Persia and Media. Babylon continues, but it's just a part of the Persian Empire at that point. Now, what Xerxes really wanted, like his father, was to conquer Greece. We touched on this a little bit last week. I didn't really get into detail because there's not a whole lot to report. Darius the Great, Darius the First, Hystaspes, he tried to some extent to conquer Greece, but he was met with very little success, and it really just didn't go very far as getting off the ground much. But Xerxes, once he's dealt with his internal problems and revolts, he turns his attention toward Greece. He's going to, like his father had envisioned and maybe on a smaller scale attempted, he's going to do a simultaneous land and sea attack on Greece. But this is obviously, as you know from history, is not going to succeed. Xerxes planned the attack for 3 years. And he even built a canal to avoid the turbulent Cape of Athos. Darius had lost a large portion of his fleet in that particular cape. So Xerxes, he recruits his army from 46 nations. He's got 29 Persian generals commanding the army, and Xerxes is the commander-in-chief. They have these straits that separate Asia Minor and Europe. They span them by a bridge. But this was no ordinary bridge. Does anybody know from history what kind of bridge this was? Or does anybody recall? Maybe you've studied this before. It's a bridge of boats. They actually line up boats, and that's how they had their bridge to get across the straits. Pretty amazing, really. These boats were built by the Phoenicians. Well, bear in mind, as Pfeiffer points out in his book, that information on this attack on Greece, when you study this historically, most of your information is coming from Greek sources. So what do you reckon that means? It's going to have a little bit of bias to it. So some of the figures, it's hard to know how accurate they are, and sometimes Pfeiffer himself will say this is almost certainly an exaggeration or something like that. So it is suspected there's a lot of exaggeration, but as Pfeiffer points out in his book, the importance of this invasion and the subsequent withdrawal of Xerxes, it would be hard to exaggerate just how crucial and big that was in world history. So Xerxes and his troops, they winter in Sardis. His armies cross the bridge from Asia to Europe in something like May or June of 480 BC. And if you have your timeline, you'll see your old intertestamental period chronology, 480 BC is going to be the key date there. So this is May or June. Xerxes sends heralds to the Greek cities to give them opportunities to submit voluntarily. He says you can send earth and water as a token of your submission. A few of them did, but most of Greece was determined they're going to fight for their independence. So he marches forward. Xerxes does. Athens and Sparta, they were at odds with each other quite a bit of the time. If you ever studied that world history, that section of world history, but they resolved their issues and they decide they're going to fight together. They appeal to all of their Greek brethren, fight for your freedom, join us. Some of them did, but not everybody. Argos and Crete, for example, remained neutral. The early battles were disastrous for the Greeks. They lost Thessaly. Middle Greece was under attack. 10,000 men under Leonidas, the Spartan commander, ended up being massacred because they were actually at one point betrayed by someone who was thought to be a friend, who showed the Persians a path over the mountain and around to the rear flank of Leonidas. And the story goes, to a man, they were killed, and Leonidas became a Greek hero dying at his post. But there's a key point here. Xerxes, he reached Athens, and he burned the temples on the Acropolis. What this said to the Greeks was, he will not respect your civilization. He will not respect your culture. You're not just fighting for who's going to be called the ruler. You're fighting for your very freedom and perhaps even your very lives. You know, Cyrus would come along and he would spare temples. He would spare these ornate buildings. He would put locals in charge. They said, look, Xerxes isn't going to be that way. And so this is not a matter of, well, you know, it's really just not worth the fight. You're fighting for your freedom. You're fighting for your civilization, for your culture, for your lives. So it really strengthened the Grecian resolve. It looked at one point like Xerxes was poised to conquer Greece, but basically, long story short, he wants to kind of go to Salamis, where the Greek fleet was concentrated, the naval fleet. And he wants it to that's going to be the deciding point, and it was. The Battle of Salamis was on September 27th or 28th, perhaps, of 480 BC, and it's one of history's most decisive battles. The Greeks, again, fighting for their homes and their lives, they utterly defeated the Persian navy. The Persian fleet, along with Xerxes, was forced to flee. Now, that wasn't the end of the Greek attempted conquest, because Xerxes still had a lot of foot soldiers. He left a man named Mardonius in charge, but after some back and forth, Mardonius was decisively defeated. Mardonius was killed. The Persian troops fled, and they just literally, I mean, it's one of those deals where, kind of like what we read about in 2 Kings chapter 7, where they fled and they left everything. I mean, there was just all kind of provisions left in the field. They got out of Dodge, as we say. Well, Herodotus says not even 3,000 Persians remained alive. But this is one of those places where Pfeiffer says this is considered an exaggeration. Well, about that time, Athens succeeded in conquering Persia's Greek allies, and before autumn, the entire Hellespont area was in Greek hands. Byzantium fell the following spring. That was Persia's last stronghold in the Greek world, and that ended the struggle between Persia and Greece. It never really was an issue after that. As far as the close of Xerxes' reign after that failed conquest of Greece, he would never again distinguish himself in battle. He lived 14 years after the failed Greek conquest. We don't really know a whole lot about that time. It is thought that during that time is when the book of Esther occurred. He kind of came back, and it's almost like he's sulking after this failed conquest, and so he decides, we're going to have a big party and this big feast, and of course he wants Vashti to come out and show herself, and she refuses, and she's dethroned, and they're going to choose a new queen, and eventually it becomes Esther. Xerxes in the Bible, tying him together with the Bible, you have at this point, remember, two main groups of Jews, which are, what are those two groups? How would we distinguish them? Jews, we'll call them Palestinian Jews because they went back home. But there are Jews who stayed and many times did well for themselves. But as far as the Palestinian Jews, the ones back home, there's only one brief reference to Xerxes, and that's in Ezra 4:6. But as mentioned on the slide here, that does bridge that gap between the dedication of the temple and the arrival of Ezra in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. But the people of the land, the Samaritans, you recall, the Edomites, other enemies of Judah, they write to Xerxes there in that passage accusing the Jews, as they always did. But here's the thing. It seems Xerxes was just too busy elsewhere to really be troubled with the Jews back home in Palestine. He just never really seems to have paid them any attention. And honestly, he kind of had his hands full, didn't he? As Pfeiffer says, this period was one of frustration and disappointment for the Jews back home who were hoping to have deliverance from the Samaritans, the Edomites, and others who constantly harassed them. But you know, in ancient times, a city without walls, is it really even a city at all? You're wide open for attack. And at this point, the walls haven't been rebuilt, so they're constantly being harassed. But if they were hoping for help from Xerxes, they really just didn't get any. He just wouldn't be troubled with them. But as far as Jews who didn't return home, their lot during the reign of Xerxes is detailed in the book of Esther, as I mentioned. And of course, you have the Jewish feast of Purim coming out of that, commemorating their deliverance from the plots of Haman. Pfeiffer notes this in his book, kind of at the end of the chapter. Xerxes was said to act like a spoiled child habitually. And when you read the book of Esther, it kind of seems to agree with that assessment, doesn't it? I mean, he's having this drunken feast. He wants his wife to come out and parade herself. And when she refuses to do so, which any normal, decent human being would, he gets all mad, and he's decided, and here comes, and that's another thing that Pfeiffer points out. He appears to have been susceptible to flattery and fawning courtiers. So they come and they say, oh, well, who knows? Every woman's liable to rebel against the king now. You've got to get rid of her, dethrone her. And he listens. And so, you see just throughout the book of Esther, it seems that's a pretty good description of his character. He was murdered by a usurper, Artabanus, in the 20th year of his reign. And that usurper was said to have reigned about 7 months before Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes, killed him. And so another interesting note here is that's kind of marks the end of Xerxes, of course. When you come to Artaxerxes the first, he's actually the third son of Xerxes, but he was the rightful heir. Here's why. I've read this, and kind of thought, well, that's not right. Usually it's the firstborn son, right? It's the firstborn son after the ruler succeeds the throne or takes the throne. So first son he had after he took the throne was Artaxerxes the first. So he was the rightful heir. That reign, Artaxerxes, is one of the best documented periods of classical antiquities, as Pfeiffer points out. This is the time of Herodotus, the Greek historian. He's often called the father of history. He was traveling throughout the world, writing his famous histories. You got Pericles in power in Athens. Famous monuments of the Parthenon were built during this time. Athens reached the zenith of its culture and influence. And so then you have Artaxerxes. He's, as per usual at this point, putting down rebellions early on. There was a kind of a rebellion, or at least a disturbance in Egypt that gave him cause for concern that had to be dealt with. You know, the Egyptians, they see Greece defying Persia, so they decided to rebel. Well, constantly dealing with rebellions there in Egypt, at least several of these rulers are. But a lot of this, as Pfeiffer points out, is attributed to the efficient governmental system of Darius had weakened during the reign of Artaxerxes. So he's got to deal with problems in Egypt. While Artaxerxes was dealing with another revolt, there's a Persian that appears. What's his name? I was looking for it in my notes. Achaemenes. He comes to Persia seeking help to bring Egypt back into submission because they're revolting. Well, bottom line, Egypt, the rebellion was put down, but it was a high price that the Persians had to pay to do that. It really weakened the empire and it weakened their control over Egypt. But it was about this time, all that's to say this, it was about this time that Ezra the scribe requested permission to go back home. He wants to lead a fresh group of Jews back to Judea. We often talk about 3 returns, right? The first one was Zerubbabel. He goes to take the first group back to Jerusalem. Second return is Ezra. He's going to go to restore the law. So he asked for permission. He was granted permission. It's interesting, Olmsted, the historian Olmsted points out that, or suggests, I don't know that we can say this dogmatically, but he says that when Ezra is called the scribe of the law of the God of heaven in Scripture, he says that's the equivalent to Secretary of State for Jewish affairs. And I'm not sure I had connected this before, but it does seem that he is going back home for his own religious reasons, spiritually, but he's also, he has some political clout as well from the king, from Artaxerxes. We've talked several times, there were Jews who stayed in Babylon, stayed in captivity, not necessarily in captivity, they were more, at least more so of a free state. They were not necessarily free to the extent of maybe like a Persian would be. But many of them stayed and prospered. You know, you have worldly-minded people, just like today. You got folks that are members of the body of Christ, but their mind is infrequently at best on spiritual things. They're worldly minded. Well, you would have people like that among the Jews, and the worldly minded, they didn't really have any concern for that settlement back in Jerusalem. I mean, whatever, y'all want to go home, knock yourselves out, but things are going pretty well for us here. But the spiritually minded people, like Ezra, they know that God is working out his purposes through the remnant that had returned. And you know what's always in the front of their mind, the spiritually minded? The promise of the Messiah. They know this is still coming. God's working out his promises. And if they were reading it, and spiritually minded would have been, they've read the prophecies of Jeremiah. I'm going to bring you back to this land. I'm going to restore you. And then one day there's coming this Messiah. They know God's working out his purposes. So Ezra gathered together a group. These colonists, they're going to go reinforce and assist the earlier settlers. They're going to deal with the rebuilding, the defense operations. And so this was the 7th year of Artaxerxes. They organized at a district in Babylonia. They bring gold, silver, temple utensils, and they start out a journey that takes them 5 months to complete. But Ezra arrives there, and he's going to lose no time beginning his work. They read, they interpreted the law, they talk about, they enforced the law, particularly in the matter of mixed marriages. Remember, Ezra's going to deal a lot with that. That occupies a lot of his time. And again, as Pfeiffer points out, remember, he is acting on the authority of the Persian government. And so when he makes a decree, it's binding religiously as a scribe of the God of heaven. Of course, he's not making new law. He's not binding himself, but he's giving them what the law of God says. But it's even binding politically because he's there at the behest of Artaxerxes, the king. Well, many of the men who had returned from Babylon were guilty of divorcing their lawful Jewish wives and marrying women of the land. You know, that had been a problem in pre-exilic times before they went into captivity. In fact, who's the most infamous for that? Solomon, right? His foreign wives turned his heart away from God, and he became idolatrous himself. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why the kingdom split, was because of Solomon being turned away by his idolatrous wives. So, Ezra, reading the scripture, says you got to put away these foreign wives, these idolatrous women, and you've done wrong in this. And so he has them assemble in Jerusalem under penalty of destruction of property and exclusion from the congregation, we might say, being ostracized. And so they have this assembly. They're putting away those alien wives was accepted in principle, and of course even saying that there are some specific cases that need some more detailed examination, but they decide to do this. And of course the enemies of Judah were not quiet and doing nothing during this time. They continually tried to keep the Jews from fortifying and protecting the city of Jerusalem. They don't want that to happen, because if Jerusalem is fortified and protected, that hinders their interests, and that hinders some of their own prosperity and such. Well, that's been going on since the Jews first returned, of course, as we read in Scripture. But in the days of Artaxerxes, they make a letter of accusation. They address it to the Persian king. They accuse the Jews of plotting rebellion against the crown. Well, of course, they're rebuilding the city, Artaxerxes. They're rebuilding it so they can rebel. They're going to fortify it, and they're going to declare themselves independent. And what are you going to do then? Well, no king likes to hear that, does he? And so Artaxerxes was nervous at the thought of rebellion. He told the Jews to stop rebuilding, Ezra 4. The enemies of Judah even tried to use force to prevent the Jews from completing their work of rebuilding the walls. And of course, that gets into Nehemiah's work. Nehemiah is the third return. He's back home in the palace, Shushan or Susa, and he's functioning as the royal cupbearer. We don't know exactly what all that office entailed, but it put him in very close proximity to the king, right? He was close to the king and had some kind of relationship with the king. You can tell just from the context of that. But basically, Nehemiah, the king can tell he's sad. What's going on, Nehemiah? Why are you so sad? He says, well, back home, the walls are just in complete disrepair. The city of my fathers is just lying in ruins. And so he says, what are you asking, Nehemiah? Nehemiah, he prayed in that very instant, and he asked him, he says, what I'm asking for is to go home and take care of this. And so he's sent home basically as governor of Judah. Again, he's got political clout. He's going home with his own spiritual purposes in mind, but he's given political clout from the king. So, if you've read Nehemiah, that the Jews were constantly harassed by those enemies. They don't want them to rebuild. They try to get Nehemiah to compromise. Hey, we'll help you. And you'll understand when we get to our seventh major section of this, we're going to talk about some of the goings on with the Jews during all of this time that we've talked about thus far. We'll talk about how the synagogue worship popped up and some of those things. But you'll understand if it seems kind of curt for Nehemiah just to say, no, you're not helping us, you have no part in this. If that seems a little short and curt, then you got to understand what's happened with some of their brethren, their Jewish brethren, who have begun to mix idolatry in with the worship of Jehovah God. And he says, no way, no how. We're not going that route. So they're determined to maintain pure religion. They even try to get Nehemiah to meet with them. Now they try compromise. Meet with us down in the valley of Ono. I told you about a classmate of mine one time. His chapel sermon was, sometimes you just have to say no to oh no. And he talked about the valley of Ono. There are all kind of valleys of Ono that people will try to get you to go down into today. It's the valley of compromise. It's the valley of getting you distracted from your work that you ought to be doing. And Nehemiah says, not happening. And so he says no to oh no. And they even threatened them with physical violence. And at one point, Nehemiah says they worked with their utensils in one hand and a weapon in the other, just in case. But they finished it, 52 days, of course, just an amazing task in itself. Ezra and Nehemiah headed the processions. They moved around the walls in opposite directions, so they kind of move around, and they meet near the site of the temple. They offered sacrifices. The sound of rejoicing is heard far off. So with this pomp and ceremony, the populace, they gather there in the temple courts. They're going to hear the reading of the law, which was probably the Pentateuch that Ezra reads to them. They're going to pledge their obedience to the law of God. This is all happening during the reign of Artaxerxes I here. And then they observe the Feast of Tabernacles. They rejoice in the goodness of God. Nehemiah, as he promised the king, goes back home. If you read Nehemiah, he goes back home, but then what? 12 years or so later, he's going to come back. And what we discover is it was hardly any sooner than he had left that they start back in their old ways. They start to, the enemies are making trouble again. The Levites aren't receiving the tithes. The laws of the Sabbath are forgotten. And guess what? Mixed marriages again. And he even says the children are heard speaking the languages of their non-Jewish mothers, the language of Ashdod, the way Scripture puts it. So Nehemiah makes a second trip, and he accomplishes a second reformation of religious and civil life. And with that, the book of Nehemiah and the history of the Old Testament comes to a close. That's why we often say, as like with our Old Testament overview, that the last book chronologically of Scripture would be Nehemiah. Because Nehemiah's reforms go to the very closest to the New Testament opening of any writings. Artaxerxes basically was not in any position to strengthen his holdings in the West, and the decline of the Persian Empire was in full swing by the time he takes over. And Egypt and Cyprus were still subject to Persia, but most of the rest of the West was gone. The Athenian fleet, they dominate the Mediterranean Sea. Thrace is self-governing, and just about all of any kind of Greek possessions that Persia had were now back to being maintained and owned and ruled by the Greeks. There are some later rulers, as you can see, Darius II, Artaxerxes II and III, Arses and Darius III, but at this point the Persian Empire is really, it's very much on its way out. And it's getting ready to give way to a young man, a young upstart. We know him very well from history. He went by the name of Alexander, but we know him better, of course, as Alexander the Great. We'll sum up those last rulers in just a brief little bit next time, Lord willing, and then we'll jump into talking about Alexander. We also want to get the kind of some of that I told you about with the synagogue worship rising up, and kind of understand some of that, and see the progress of the Jews during this time. Again, kind of trying to tie all this history together with what we read about in the Bible. Anything, questions or whatever? I know we're out of time, but if you got a question, tell me and I'll write it down and we'll get to it next week. Either I'm doing a really great job or the history's just putting you all to sleep. I don't know. Thank you very much. We'll have a break before worship.